Good morning. Coming to you today from my home office in my home in Fontana. I just want to remind you that obviously we are not meeting. Next week is our spring break, March 25th, and so there is no study due for that day. However, please continue your study. We just finished Job. We're about to start Thessalonians. Please make sure you do your study even while we're not meeting. We are working on another way to continue study in spite of the fact that our church is closed. It's critically important that we stay in the Word. So please continue in your study, and we're going to get back to that as soon as we can. We'll let you know how we're going to proceed from this point. Also, I want you to please continue praying for the needs of our class, and if any of you need prayer for anything, please feel free to contact us, contact your core leader, and please keep in touch with them. We're still here for you. We're all in our homes, and if there's anything you need, let us know. I want to also remind us to pray for CBSI in Belarus. They are continuing to try to grow, and they face some opposition from the government and other churches there. So I just pray that that study would continue to grow and that we would be able to help assist in that. Also, we want to thank Vanessa and Judy so much for caring for our children. My little granddaughter's been over there, and they've been caring for her and other leaders' children, and I just pray blessing for them. Thank you so much. We so appreciate that. That helps all of us do the work that the Lord's called us to do. I want to tell you what the aim would be if your children were there. So if you want to focus on this aim as you do the studies with them. The children's aim was to teach the children that God wants them to serve others just as Jesus did when he washed his disciples' feet. The children's verse is, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. John 14:6. The youth summary was that Job was blameless and blessed by God. Job remained faithful through hopeless suffering. The youth challenge was seek to know and truly understand God's might and glory. We had a speaker set up for our introduction on Wednesday. Obviously that has to be rescheduled, but that was Andy and Margaret Anderson, and they were church planters in Tanzania, Africa, East Africa. They used community Bible study for some of the work that they were doing there. And that is all for the announcements. We are working to keep Bible study going even while we cannot meet, so please keep in touch. As I said before, keep in touch with your core leaders and let us know if you have any prayer requests. Keep up with your studies. We've been encouraged to share Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. We also could share Exodus 14:14. This echoes the same phrase, the Lord will fight for you, you need only be still. And Psalm 62:5 says, for God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. During these difficult times, even when it's hard to trust, he's the only one that we can trust. Barbara is out of town, and so pray for safe travels for her as she returns. It was previously scheduled that I would speak, and so here I am, giving the teaching. So I will begin the review of our lesson in Job. And I was thinking about what I learned from the book of Job and what was the value of studying this book. I had always heard that Job was about suffering, and it is. It's about the suffering of one man, Job, but it is much more about a sovereign God who owes us nothing yet loves us and graciously gives us and all creation what we need. It's about a relationship with God. And what is the motivator for maintaining that relationship? Do we love God for his gifts or for himself? How are we supposed to respond to suffering, our own and the suffering of others? We learn that lamenting is okay, complaining is not. We learn that suffering opens our eyes to who God is in a way that we could not fathom otherwise. In Job, we see God revealed in a new way to Job, and it impacts our own hearts. It reminds me of that song by Michael W. Smith, Open the Eyes of My Heart, Lord, open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I won't sing it. That would not be good. or you may remember it. Some of you know that I recently moved, and in the course of unpacking, I found a journal. It's right here. And it's from about 4 years ago. I am a fickle journaler, so about halfway through is when I stop. I'm usually pretty good for the first half of the year, and then about halfway through I quit. I still study, I just don't write it all down that way. At any rate, this is from 2016, and in March of 2016 I was studying John, which we will all be studying next year in CBS, so be sure to sign up for that. 2016 for me was a combination of joy and persistent pain. My son and daughter-in-law were engaged at the time of my journal entry. My middle child was 5 years into a chronic battle with her physical and mental health, and she had walked away from Jesus. And here's what I wrote. March 21st, 2016, death of Lazarus. This was from John 11, verses 3 through 6. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, the one you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Verse 5, I double underlined. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 more days longer in the place where he was. That's why I double underlined it. He loved him. He stayed 2 more days. What? He loved them, so he stayed put for 2 more days? I imagine if I called someone I loved and said, Mike is sick, those who loved me would show up at the hospital to love and support me, pray with me, hug me. I imagine if someone who loved me knew the medicine that could cure my daughter, he or she would quickly administer it and alleviate any more pain, heartache, or suffering. I imagine that eliminating suffering is better than allowing it, because I imagine that healing immediately glorifies God. God apparently knows otherwise. There is a different end game for suffering. It is purposeful, useful in training us to trust him. Immediate relief would have been nice. 5 years ago, I would have praised him for a moment, and Kara would have lived a normal life. Instead, I see death of who she used to be, loss of her faith in the God she once enjoyed communion with, and entanglement in sin that threatens her eternal destiny. She's tried to take her own life, continues to hurt and scar herself, and lives on the edge of suicide every day. This is what we were living through in 2016. How does this glorify God? Mary and Martha couldn't see how Lazarus' death glorified God. When Jesus came, they both said the same thing. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus said the illness wouldn't end in death. Jesus said it was to glorify God and his Son. Why didn't Jesus show up? Because he loved them. I've wondered why Jesus won't show up and fix my girl. Why did church people quit talking to her, and why won't he send other Christians to save her or influence her? Why does she persist in pursuits of things the Lord hates? Where's the glory of God? It's been 5 years. She has scars up and down her arms. She has no real friends. She's stuck, just as stuck as Lazarus in the tomb. This illness doesn't end in death. It is to glorify God and his Son. He loves us too much for a quick fix. He's growing me to trust him. And growth is hard and painful and tedious on the daily, so I trust him, and I look forward to his glory one day. That was a good trust day. I had other days that weren't so good. Jesus didn't show up in the way I wanted or expected. My daughter is still sick, and she's still not walking with the Lord. We have a beautiful relationship. She calls me almost every day, but she's not walking with Jesus. And she's sick. Not life-threatening, but she's in pain every day. So, even though he didn't show up the way I wanted him to, I know as Job knew that my Redeemer lives and that I will see him no matter what happens to any of my children, though I hope for the Lord's mercy in keeping them safe. Like Job, I said some foolish things about God, and like Job, I found when my eyes were opened, I saw God for who he is, and my arguments I would have made to him were just foolishness. So what is the value of the study of Job? Number one, I saw that God sees us. He was familiar with Job. I think that was my favorite thing, that he knew his name. He knew his life. And he was praising him, saying there was no one like him on the face of the earth. David writes, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know. You know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways." And that's from Psalm 139, 1-3. God saw Job and loved him. Hagar in the wilderness called God El Roi, the God who sees me. He sees you too. This mighty creator of all things sees you and knows your name. And that's encouraging to me. He's not some distant deity that doesn't have anything to do with us. He knows us. 2, we have an enemy, Satan, who wants to destroy and devour us. But God limits his power. But God allows him to wound us for purposes we may never know or understand this side of heaven. 3, I learned how to rest in God's goodness in spite of circumstances. Job was right on target in his faith walk at first. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And even when his wife gave up, Job remained faithful and said, "Shall we receive good from God and not evil?" But staying in faith is hard when the circumstances persist for long. And anyone who has struggled long knows this to be true. You begin to wonder why it's happening. And people often wonder why bad things happen to good people. A simplistic answer to that is that none of us are good. Another, that we live in a sinful world and creation is crying out until Jesus returns to make all things new. God said Job was blameless, so why did he allow this to happen to him? Why do our trials happen to us? And John Piper says the following: "I pictured Job as a beaker of water. Job had been so worked upon by the grace of God that his life was pure. You could see right through the water. People looked at him and they saw a pure man. But there was sediment of self-reliance and pride on the bottom. It wasn't huge and it wasn't damning, but it was there. When God shook Job, the sediment colored the water. And you find Job saying some terrible things about God in this book. God knew it was there, and he knew that in shaking this godly, blameless man, there would arise some imperfection into his life, and that it would need to be purged. There are other theories as well. I read an article by a person named Eric Ortland. The article was called 5 Truths for Sufferers from the Book of Job, and in it he discusses the 3 different kinds of suffering. There's suffering for our own sin, and in that case, repentance is required. There's suffering that can grow us as a Christian, and in that case, we're supposed to persevere joyfully. And then there's Job's kind of suffering. What do we do with that? The author states that God called Job blameless, so it wasn't sin, as his friends suggested, that caused his calamity. The author also states that nowhere in the book is it suggested that God allows the tragedy of chapters 1 and 2 to give Job some virtue or moral quality that he is lacking. He was doing everything he knew to do to worship the Lord. He had faith, he was sacrificing, he was living rightly, he's giving to the poor. All the things in this book suggest that he was living the life that he was called to live in the Lord. So the author goes on to say, it appears we need a 3rd category of suffering. Sometimes God allows pain and loss that have nothing to do with sin in our lives and are not meant to teach us anything. Rather, our loss and bewilderment become an avenue by which God gives himself to us more than he ever could before when we were at ease. When God puts us into a position where we must hold on to our relationship with God for God's sake only, in which we stand to gain nothing but God, we start to receive him more fully than we ever had before. Job's amazed cry, "Now my eyes see you," becomes our own. Number 4, I learned how to be a good friend and a bad one. In the last 9 or 10 years, I've experienced both kinds. I had one who kept giving me little quips that I found annoying rather than helpful, like, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I run marathons. In a marathon, you know where the finish line is, and usually nobody dies in the 3 to 6 hours it takes to complete the race. So that kind of fell flat for me. But I have another friend, and I found her card in the journal that I found today. And that friend, in a note inside the card, she wrote that she assures me she's praying for me, that she's sorry for what we're going through, and she expresses her love for us. And she included the words to a song, Beautiful Things by Gungor. It still makes me cry. I want to be that kind of friend. Job's friends started out well. They came, they sat with him in silence for 7 days. It was not until they opened their mouths that they became a discouragement to Job. I remember one day at church, a friend who was also going through her own suffering saw me in the church in the pew behind her, and she reached out her hand and squeezed my hand and never said a word. And that meant more to me than 1,000 words. Silence is golden. I learned it's okay to lament but not complain. Though Job said some terrible things about God, all he said maintained a deep faith in God. He didn't understand. He wanted a hearing. He even wanted to die. But he knows that his Redeemer lives. He knows the Lord sees him. And we know that because of this verse, but he knows the way that I take. When he has tried me, I shall come out as gold, from Job 23:10. In an article entitled, Where is God When It Hurts?, Paul Carter relates a story given by C.S. Lewis in A Grief Observed. And this is the quote from C.S. Lewis. Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face, a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that silence, you may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. And he said this in response to the death of his wife to cancer. That is exactly what Job is saying in Job 23. He was saying, oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I do not perceive him. On the left hand, when he is where he is working, I do not behold him. He turns to the right hand, but I do not see him. And that's from Job 23:8 and 9. The author says, I can't see God, Job cries, but he sees me. It's important to know that even when we're suffering, God is here. God isn't abandoning us. God has not double bolted the door. It may seem that way to us, but we need to be patient. We need to keep going back to him. Number 6, I learned that God owes me nothing. This is hard for me to understand why this is impacting me the way that it is, but it's humbling. It's recognizing that he holds all the power and I don't hold any of it. And I don't know why that makes me grateful for him and just grateful for who he is as God. I've said more than once that God hasn't answered any of our prayers for our daughter the way I asked. And just 2 weeks ago, I was about to ask our small group to pray again for the Lord to intervene in the path our daughter is taking. And in the middle of my request, I just said, never mind. Never mind. Just pray that she comes back to Jesus. And is that a lack of faith? Maybe. But I think it's also that I can't presume to know God's plan or ask for things I don't understand. This does not end in death, physical or spiritual. That is my hope. Moving on. So if you are suffering today, my hope for you after the study of Job is that you know the God of heaven and that you trust him to sustain you. If suffering isn't where you are right now, remember those who are suffering and be there for them, especially in this time with COVID and people are housebound. Remember the people that need a little extra help, need a little extra prayer, we don't recommend going to visit people, but if there's something you can do for them over the phone, keep in touch with people. But people are going to be lonely in this isolation. Also remember that this whole story points us to the mediator that Job cries out for. He says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has thus been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another." Job 19:25-27. We have that hope in Jesus Christ. He is our Redeemer. He is our mediator before the Lord. And so we can trust him with our suffering and with our joy and with everything in our lives. The Lord promises restoration of lost fortunes. Job in chapter 42 exalts in the knowledge that while before he had heard about God, now he had seen him for himself. He has reached a greater understanding of who God is, and after that all his fortunes are restored, and he has given double what he had before. We know that our Redeemer lives. We know that whether in this life or the next, he will restore all that was lost in our suffering. And I pray that for all of us today, that we would recognize that we have a hope and a future in the Lord Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the book of Job. Though difficult, is so beautiful in how you reveal yourself to Job and to us. I pray, Lord, for this COVID-19 virus to dissipate quickly, and that you would protect all of us and bring us back safely to Bible study and to your word. And I pray this in Jesus'